Guys, settle down back there. You guys don't settle down, we're just going to cancel church for the night. Y'all can go home. All right. Normally, I don't know, I feel like we need a confession this evening to start off. I heard Noah came into the building and he told me that somebody in his family decided it was a good idea to play Christmas music on the way here. Are you guys aware that Halloween hasn't even come and gone yet? Anyways, so we'll deal with that at the, oh, you got your hand up? What are you?
There's green Christmas lights, Christmas tree lights over there at Greenwich and 96 already up, ready to go.
Well, if the people over off Greenwich jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge too? Yeah. We're going to be in Acts chapter 18, so go ahead and open your Bibles there. Hopefully, I think last week I said read Acts 17, and hopefully you ignored me and read the first part of Acts 18 to read about how Corinth was established, how the church there was planted by Paul. So we're going to continue with this study, and let's see. David, do you mind starting us off with the prayer?
Father, we are thankful for this good day you've given us, and we are especially grateful for the good rain we've received in the last day or so, and looking forward to getting over the next few days. We see the change of seasons, your handiwork, and the tradition in which we live, and so thankful for all you do to provide for us. And especially thankful for the freedom that allows us to come together freely as we're doing this evening to engage in the study of your word, to prepare ourselves to serve you in this life. Father, we appreciate so much what your Son was willing to do, leaving heaven to come into this earth, and to be willing to subject himself to all the mistreatment and the harshness that humanity dish out. He was willing to undergo that suffering in order to pay the price for our sins. That we're so thankful that we have an avenue of salvation through him, and we ask you to give us the wisdom to be able to apply his teaching and example in our lives, the world might be able to see him. Pray to be with Sam, the teachers this evening, as they impart the word, that the things that they teach will sink in good and honest hearts and accomplish the good that you desire. Be with those who might be with us this evening. Forgive us of our sins.
Amen. All right. So I got a picture behind me of Corinth, and Corinth, unlike Thessalonica, last week if you were here, we talked about the church in Thessalonica, and the problem with excavating Thessalonica is that a modern city is built on top of it. So there's really not that much that you're able to dig up in that area. That's really the problem still in Jerusalem too. There's just so much of that they're not allowed to touch, sometimes because it's occupied by Muslims or they have something built on that and they don't want them tearing it up, or vice versa. The Jews have something built on it, and homes and different things as well that just prevent you from being able to really do all the excavating that you could do. Well, Corinth, that's not the case, because Corinth was a city that lasted through the centuries, and now I'm spacing. It was either I think it was, oh man, now I'm spacing. It was the late 1800s, I believe. There was a huge earthquake, and so it just decimated the city. And so what they did at that point is they simply abandoned that area of Corinth, and they built another city 3 miles away. And so that allowed them to really go in and start doing a lot of excavating in the city of Corinth, and to kind of dig up and see what's there through the centuries. And so this is a very ancient city. You can go back to the 7th and 8th century, and it's a city, but it's also two cities as we look at the church in Corinth. And when Paul comes to Corinth, that city is in its second iteration, so to speak, because, again, Corinth was this Greek city for a very long time. It was a rival city to Athens, and so it was always Athens and Corinth that were kind of competing for being these prominent Greek cities. and then a Roman general came through sometime in the 2nd century BC and just totally conquered it, decimated it, destroyed it, had the citizens shipped off. And so, interestingly, Corinth lay desolate for almost a century, and that is until they started to rebuild it around 40 BC, and it became a capital, a Roman capital of the province of Achaia. And so that's the region that Corinth sits in, is in Achaia, and just what they've discovered, this is just a small slice of it. Those are probably living quarters or something like that, or maybe that's the marketplace. I think that actually is the marketplace, and there's a road that leads to it, and some people suppose that this is probably where Paul would have set up his tent-making area with Aquila and Priscilla, as we read about that in Acts 18, that that's where he meets them and begins building or making tents with them, because that's what he did by trade and that's what they did by trade, and so they kind of go in on this joint venture together. But then behind you have this temple of Apollo, but that's not anything special, considering when you look at what they've excavated, there's just all sorts of pagan temples littered just like that all over the place. So very heavily paganistic culture, but that's not anything unusual for the world at that time. Behind there, you have the mountain, I think it's called Corinth, something like that. I'm probably butchering that. But it was this obviously huge mountain that, Paul would have showed up to Corinth. That would have been the first thing that he would have seen, and it would have stuck out to him. And on top of there, I believe they had a temple to Aphrodite, who was this pagan goddess that was associated with a lot of nonsense. And so this is just kind of, again, a picture of the city, but I think it helps to get a picture of the geography as well. When Paul gets to Corinth, this is his second missionary journey. So did his first, now this is his second, and it's kind of towards the end, not chronologically though, because he spends a lot of time in Ephesus, but as far as stops, he stops here at Corinth. It's one of the last few stops on that journey. And you can kind of see where it's positioned, and that's a very important spot geographically, kind of like Thessalonica. We talked last week how it was this city, this port city, and it was close to a major trade route, and so that brought a lot of traffic. Corinth was kind of similar. This is called an isthmus, or I'm going to butcher that. I can't say that. Anyways, you know what I'm trying to say. And all that is this narrow portion of land that has, two coasts on each side. That's what they call that. And basically, that little narrow portion of land, it joined two different seas. It joined the Aegean Sea, and then on the other side, you had the Ionian Sea. And for a long time, people wanted to build a canal that ran through there, because it makes sense, right? If you could take that portion of land away, then you could be sending ships in between it, no problem. And there's guys that had this idea as early as the 6th century BC, and he was discouraged from it because he was told by somebody that the gods wouldn't like it, they'd be upset with them, so he didn't pursue it. Nero, he tried to do it, and he failed. He just gave up because it was impossible. There's so much rock. It wasn't until like the late 1800s that they were able to successfully build this canal, and it was only due to the invention of dynamite. So that's what allowed them to do that. But even before they had this canal to send large ships through, they had a road that was built, and this road basically allowed for materials and trade items to be dropped off on one side of that landmass there. So the major port there would have been Cenchrea, and then there's another port on the other side there as well. And so anyways, that road, it went from one side of that portion of land to the other, and it allowed you to take that material from one port to the next, but they would have to wheel it to the other side. In some cases, they could take small boats across there as well. All that to say that this attributed a lot to Corinth's economy. And so again, it was kind of a big trade place, and a place where a lot of business was done, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that soon. But I have that quote there. Again, a person says, control these two harbors in its position virtually astride the 6-kilometer wide isthmus. linking the Peloponnese to mainland Greece made Corinth the great crossroads of the ancient world. So yeah, that piece of land there, it's only about 5 miles wide. It was very, very narrow, but it became kind of important for travelers, for trade, and for all sorts of things. And so like Thessalonica, it became kind of this hub where a lot of business was done, and for more than that reason alone, which we'll talk about. Ignore that first quote, but again, just talking about the attractions of Corinth. The city offered migrants opportunities to improve their social and economic status through employment and the bustling service economy of the city. We'll talk more about that in a second. The city of Corinth was a major tourist attraction in itself, and visitors regarded a stay there as a participation in a joyous, continual celebration. And then this is interesting as well. Corinth was host to the biennial Isthmian Games. And all that is, it was similar to the Olympic Games. So this was a place where these big sporting games were held biannually, and it was dedicated to the god Poseidon. And anyways, there's some people that think Paul's maybe first visit correlated with one of those games as it was happening, and we see that Paul uses a lot of kind of sports imagery. Even in his letter to the Corinthians, he's drawing on some of that. In fact, he talks about in the letter to the Corinthians about receiving an imperishable crown, and he compares it to a perishable crown. Well, probably drawing on these wreaths that they would get placed on their heads when they would win these sporting competitions, and those are perishable, right? But we are working for an imperishable crown. There's one quote that, I'll say this too. This is interesting to me as I was studying. I think one of the main things that is often brought out about Corinth is how especially morally corrupt it was compared to the rest of the world. And what I found in every commentary that I read, and every dictionary and encyclopedia that I read that is recent, when I say recent, the last 30, 40 years, they all said that that's kind of been blown out of proportion a little bit. That really, when you dig into it, Corinth probably wasn't any worse than any other city at its time. That's not to say that it was good, so I'm not defending Corinth, but this idea that it was like just super duper bad compared to a place like Thessalonica, they say there's really no evidence of that. And so this person says, this is just one that represents a lot of different quotes that express similar or the same thing. He said, in reality, Corinth was neither better nor worse than its contemporaries. It was not dedicated to the goddess of love, Aphrodite, and they did have a temple there, but he's saying it wasn't dedicated to her. They had lots of temples there to lots of deities. And a lot of this came from this guy named Strabo, who told of 1,000 sacred prostitutes being there in Corinth. And what this guy says is that that's pure fabrication. What other people said is that was true, but it was true of the first iteration of Corinth when it belonged to Greece, and then it gets destroyed and it's a new city. In either case, when you read the letter, you can tell that sexual immorality was a huge issue, at the very least, for the church in Corinth. And if there wasn't anything special or excessive about the immorality of the city of Corinth compared to other cities where churches were planted, it kind of makes it even more interesting to me to ask the question, well then why? Why was it that this was something that the people in Corinth especially struggled with? When I say the people in Corinth, I mean the church in Corinth. If it wasn't, if we can't blame the environment around them, if the environment wasn't necessarily worse than any other Greco-Roman environment of that day, then why was this such a huge struggle for the Corinthian church compared to other churches that Paul planted? Any thoughts on that? I don't have an answer. Anyways, I don't have an answer for that. I just think it's kind of interesting. And maybe it's a little bit sobering that we don't necessarily have to be in a worse environment to be struggling with worse sins. I think that's a much more humbling approach when you kind of consider that. Those guys could be wrong, though. Who knows? But that's kind of what I found in all the reading that I was doing. So this is the quote that I put on your introduction. I want to talk about this for a second. And again, this is just one quote that represents a lot of things I was reading. But they describe it like this. Corinth was a truly new city with no indigenous landed elite. The military veterans and former slaves, freedmen or freed persons, that had been settled here by Julius and Augustus had the possibility of significant upward mobility in the midst of a world where such social climbing was strikingly rare. They could become, within a few generations, the local elites holding civic offices, gaining wealth through trade and business, and establishing a reputation that would have been impossible in many older established cities. Making a name for oneself, what Paul tends to refer to as boasting, was not just a Corinthian thing, but a self-promotion was uncommonly at home in Corinth. Let me just summarize what that's saying. This city was destroyed, and then they decided to pick it back up and to rebuild it under Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus. And you can't rebuild a city without a population. And so the way that they repopulated it was they sent ex-military, they sent slaves that had been freed, and those are the people that began to rebuild this place. And what I read from one person is that how a lot of people were making their income to start off was they were robbing graves of people that had formerly died when this city had been destroyed. But what they're saying is because there was nobody there that, had owned land for, with their family through the centuries, there's nobody there that had established themselves as kind of being in control or having some sort of influence. It was a completely clean slate. And in that time in history, whatever your social status was, it wasn't quite like America where, the idea is if you work hard enough, if you come up with a good idea, right, you can strike it rich, and you can, you can have the white picket fence, and we call that the American dream, right? You didn't really have that for the most part in the first century. You were kind of locked into where you were, and you just took what you could get. Well, Corinth blew that out of the water, that if you're willing to work hard, here's a city that is starting from scratch, and if you make tents, you come to town, you're going to be one of the few tent makers, right? Or whatever it is that you do, you're going to be able to jump in and do it if you work hard enough for it. And so that also included not just opportunities for sales and trade, but even, they need people to run these cities and to act as judges and rulers and leaders, and to kind of carry out whatever needs to be done from a political standpoint. All that was up for grabs. And I think that's really interesting, and I think it sheds a lot of light on what we see in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And so just, I'll kind of put this out there, based off that quote and based off that understanding, how do you think that would have affected the environment in Corinth, culturally? Maybe in a negative way. I mean, obviously there's some positives there, but maybe negatively, how might that have impacted the culture in Corinth?
Everything goes, right? If you have a city that is operationally sound, that's been the city for hundreds of years, there's a rule base, right? There's protection order.
Yeah.
Things are done. In this situation, it's free for all.
Mm-hmm.
Whoever can be top dog, can be top dog.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I even read that there was insecurity when it came to the status that you had achieved, because that, you might have achieved great status for now, but that could change so quickly. And, how are we determining what makes one person better than the next when you don't have these kind of established roles for centuries? And so one guy comes out of nowhere, he does something great, but then another guy comes out of nowhere and he does something even better and proves himself to be better. And so you can imagine how it becomes kind of this dog-eat-dog type of environment, hyper-competitive, but then at the same time, because it's competitive, you're probably always watching your back and feeling a little bit insecure as well. Yeah, maybe wondering about, yeah. So that's the other question. Do we see that attitude coming through in the letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians? And I think Larry pointed out one. So what are you talking about, Larry? Yeah. Yeah, which one's better, right? And, well, I got tongues, I'm better, right? Or I can prophesy, I'm better. And Paul's saying, he ends up saying, look, if you speak in tongues or if you prophesy, but you don't have love, you're nothing, and you're worth nothing. So, and you gain nothing, is what he ends up saying. But yeah, they were competing with each other, and looking at these gifts is a reason to say, I'm better than you are. And Paul's saying, you've really missed it. But that makes sense when you put it into this context, that they were doing that. What else do you see similar to that in the letter to the Corinthians?
First chapter, first letter. I am Paul, I am Apollos, I am Cephas. They were lining up their heroes.
Yeah, and Paul baptized me. He's pretty cool. Well, he's not as cool as Cephas, Peter actually walked with Jesus and didn't persecute Christians, and they were, again, taking great pride in these men that had baptized them, and Paul's saying, what are you doing? But it makes sense when you plug it into that historical context that they were looking at any opportunity to kind of exalt themselves and then also kind of demean others as well, hold others down. Other examples that you see in the letters to the Corinthians. I think that it's just everywhere. Yep. Yes. Yeah, and I think even what's going on there is that the social status that existed in Corinth is coming into the church, where it seems like the rich were given priority in the Lord's Supper, and then the poor were getting the scraps, which is exactly what you would have done in Corinth. If you're a rich person, you have slaves and a full house. The rich, honorable people, they get the good stuff, and then the slaves and the poor, they get the scraps. And it seems like that's what was going on in the Lord's Supper, that they were filling up on it, and others weren't given an opportunity to take it. Other things, to me, I just think that context shines so much light on what we see in 1 Corinthians in particular, and 2 Corinthians. What about them suing each other and trying to get the best of each other in that regards? This just kind of pops up everywhere when you kind of have that in your mind and you read that letter. So maybe go back and read it with that in mind. This is an example of this kind of thing. I should have put the name of who this was dedicated to. I think his name was Babius. Yeah, I think that was his name, Babius. Good old Babius. Maybe if I have a son, I'll name him Babius. What do you guys think? But this was, what you're seeing on the right, so on the left, that's a sketch of what used to be on the right. And on the right, that is the top portion, this piece that's standing on top of those 8 columns. And what this was it was put up by a man named Babius, and it was dedicated to him because he was a man that evidently had been a slave and was freed, and he ended up in Corinth, and he became, first he was involved in public service in the sense that he was deciding, where money went, and probably was like in charge of kind of running those games that they would have every 2 years. Then he also achieved, and this is all in that inscription there, he was known as a chief priest. So he was a chief priest of something, maybe some pagan god or something like that. But then he also achieved basically the role of a judge. They kind of have one of 2 roles of a main magistrate in that area, and he became one of them. And so this is a kind of rags to riches story. And this is similar to like when you walk in the park and you see a bench is like dedicated to somebody, has their name on it, and it's, so-and-so dedicated money to make this happen. It's kind of like that, except if the person that paid money to build the parks decided themselves, I'm going to put a bench here and have my name inscribed on it. That's exactly what this guy did. He built this monument. He commissioned that it be built himself. He decided that the funds should go to it. I mean, this whole thing was his project, and it was meant to memorialize all these great things he achieved in his life. And what that shows you is that there was just kind of this self-promotional, self-congratulatory spirit that was going on in Corinth. And I think very similar, although we do it maybe in somewhat more subtle ways in our culture, but I think that's very similar to our culture, where we don't necessarily make an inscription or a post that describes all the great things I've done, but we will show a picture of it, right? Or you hear about people that donated a lot of money or something like that, and they're the ones that told everybody they donated a lot of money. They're posting about it or posting a video of it. Anyways, this is a very self-promotional kind of environment that existed at that time. And so, again, I think that also sheds light on the letter to the Corinthians. There's one passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. And a lot of 2 Corinthians, Paul is defending, his qualifications, right? He's having to defend, why they should even listen to him. Because apparently he had these group of guys that were boasting and were holding themselves up as being greater, and Paul's having to kind of defend himself from that. And in chapter 3, in verse 1, he says, "Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are a letter of recommendation written on our hearts to be known and to be read by all. And you show that you are a letter from Christ delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts." And so Paul is saying, do you want to know our achievements? Do you want to know how you can, or do you want to know why you should trust us? He says, I don't need a letter written by somebody. He's saying, I don't even need to commend myself. He says, you are our letter. This work that we have done in you, this gospel that we've shared in you, and the effect that it's had, we don't need tablets of stone that have our names inscribed on it. We have the tablets of your hearts and how they've been hopefully changed and transformed, and that's all the letter of recommendation that we need. I can't help but wonder if Paul's kind of holding himself up a little bit here in comparison and contrast to the kind of self-promotional spirit that seemed to be prevalent there in Corinth at the time. So that's kind of a little bit of my spiel as far as a background on Corinth. And I said we're going to read chapter 18. We didn't do that. We'll do that now. But yeah, chapter 18 of Acts, chapter 18 of the book of Acts. And the church here starts kind of similar to how a lot of the churches started for Paul. And I'll skip the part about him working with Aquila and Priscilla, and I'll start in verse 5. It says, "When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, 'Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles.' And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, 'Do not be afraid, but go on speaking, do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people.' And he stayed 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, 'This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law.' But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, 'If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names on your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things.' And he drove them out from the tribunal, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio paid no attention to any of this." And so again, just kind of a rundown. Typically, this kind of goes how it often goes. Paul goes to the synagogue. He is kind of reviled and rejected by most of them, although some of them evidently listened and were converted by what he says. He stays in a man's house that's right next door to the synagogue, so that's kind of funny. I wonder if that's where he was teaching from. Eventually, Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, and his family and others with him is converted. And verse 11 tells us he stayed there 1 year and 6 months. So as far as what I can remember up to this point in the book of Acts, this is the most amount of time that he spends in a local area, in a local congregation. Then he's tried by the Jews before Gallio, this judge in the area. And Gallio rejects the Jews' complaint, says, this is just a dispute over words and things having to do with your own law. I don't want anything to do with it. And then the Jews take Sosthenes, who apparently replaced Crispus, and they beat him in front of Gallio there. And then at that point, after many days, it says Paul leaves. So one thing that immediately stands out to me that's unique compared to these other churches is Paul spent a year and a half there. How long did he spend in Thessalonica? Seems like it was 3 weeks, maybe a month, right? And now here's Paul for a year and a half. And let's just maybe do a rundown. Went backwards. What are some problems? Again, if you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians before class, or just as you reflect on that letter, those two letters, what are some problems that come up in the Corinthian church? Yeah. So, yeah, sexual immorality, yep. What was kind of the most, taking people to court, and what was the most egregious example of sexual immorality? Go ahead, Michael. Yeah, maybe a stepmother, it's probably, but who knows?
Possibly,
Yeah.
the reference to Oedipus, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
is that it's implying that if the Gentiles aren't okay with you taking your money,
Yeah.
then you as a Christian should definitely not be
Yeah.
okay with that.
Yeah.
We saw that as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and so it could be, there's debate on that for sure. So, but either way, it's a gross situation, you know. Yeah, so that was a big one, obviously a horrible situation. What else? Yep. And they're dividing over more than one thing. You know, they're just going to be splintered at a certain point. At first, we read about them dividing over these teachers that they have, but then they're going to be dividing over the fact that they're suing one another, and then they're also going to be dividing over these spiritual gifts. And so they're just finding anything. It's like anything that comes up, that's a reason to divide for them. What else? What was that? Oh, yeah, food. So, eating meat sacrificed to idols. And you have some people that were unwilling to give up that right if it made their brother stumble, is what's kind of implied by what Paul has to say. And so Paul eventually says, look, if eating meat causes my brother to stumble, I'll never eat meat again. So that was an issue. What else? Obviously in 2 Corinthians, what's the main issue there? Seems one of the main issues. The super apostles, these guys that were kind of holding themselves up as being superior to Paul, and people being persuaded by them, and those guys kind of leading a rebellion against Paul. So I just have a list here. Divisions over teachers, divisions over personal matters. That's, when they're suing each other. Divisions over gifts, divisions by social class. I think you see that in the Lord's Supper. Again, if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, I think this is kind of interesting. 1 Corinthians 11, in verse 22, he says, "What, do you not have houses to eat or drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not." So again, it's not just the extent to which they were eating, which is what we often bring out in that text, but it was the effect it was having on other members of the congregation as well, kind of humiliating those who have nothing. And so you see those social classes coming into the church, and they're not supposed to come into the church. We're supposed to be one in Christ, but that's not how it was in Corinth. Immorality, and then tolerance of that immorality, which are two different things, right? You got people that were performing these immoral acts, but then you had people that were okay with it. And you have that interesting phrase that's said in 1 Corinthians 5, where Paul brings up that perverse situation that Michael brought up. And he says in verse 2, "You are arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you." And then again in verse 6, he says, "Your boasting's not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump?" And I've always taken that like somehow they were boasting or were proud of what this guy was doing. And that could be the case. It could be that they were looking at this like, wow, the grace of Jesus just lets you do anything you want. And that could have been what was going on. Or it could just be that Paul is saying, look, you guys are so proud, you become so arrogant about just everything. But look what's going on in your church. Look what's going on amongst you. Just look at yourselves. You are doing something. Here you're so proud of yourselves. you're tolerating something that not even the Gentiles tolerate. That could be kind of the sense Paul says that as well. But they're tolerating it in either case. Questioning of Paul's integrity and qualifications. We see that in 2 Corinthians. They covet their rights over edification of brethren, right? And that conversation with meat sacrificed to idols, in air quotes, a lot of your translations will put, all things are lawful for me. But Paul says what? Not everything builds up, right? And it's his response, I think, to the sentiment that existed there in Corinth, that, I can just do whatever I want. And Paul says, no, you're not thinking this through. Okay, maybe you're allowed to do this thing, but are you thinking about how this affects the brother that you worship with? Is it building him up? Is it helping him get to heaven? Is it helping him get closer to God? Or for the sake of your rights, which you don't have to have, but for the sake of your right, are you causing your brother to stumble and thereby sinning, committing a great sin by allowing that to happen? And then there's just this constant thread where they're valuing human wisdom over love and the wisdom of God. And so I just wanted to go through that real quick, and there's some that's left off of that, no doubt. But the question that I have on here, let's see, question 2. Paul spent 1.5 years with this group, yet they had the most problems of perhaps any other church Paul planted. How is that possible, considering Paul spent comparably more time there than with most other groups he planted? Again, compared to Thessalonica, it ends up being this shining example of what a church should look like in many ways. Not that they were perfect, but they weren't having the problems that Corinth had. And so, that's kind of my question. How is it that Paul spent 1.5 years here, and all these problems pop up when he's gone? How is that possible? Yeah.
After 1.5 years teaching everyone that was there, everyone that came the 3 months after that, 6 months after that, 18 months, it was all just a little bit different.
That's a good point. Yeah, you probably would have a lot of turnover there, just with how intense that place was, and but also just, again, like you said, it was this attraction where people were constantly coming and going, probably. So there probably was a lot of turnover in the church, and I hadn't thought of that like that. Other thoughts? Go ahead, Dave.
We can talk about it in Acts 18, but in verse 9, there's this rather odd statement where the Lord appears to Paul in a vision and say, don't be afraid, speak up, do your work here, because I'm in the people in this city.
Yeah,
That never happened anywhere else. At least
true.
not told. I get the impression here that Paul sized up Corinth and said, this is hopeless.
Yeah.
There were so many of the kind of issues that you were describing that he was thinking, there's no way I can salvage anything. And, I said, I have people here.
Yeah. No, I like
It's going to take a while to find them, but I want you to stay here and preach and do your work. And if it took 1.5 years, find them.
Yeah, yeah. It's a good point. And, it's interesting, that thing with Gallio actually worked out for the better, because now you know that the governor in charge here, he's kind of at least more on the side of the Christians than he is on the Jews, or at least he's not going to be persuaded by the Jews like they had so often done in Paul's previous, journeys and destinations. Go ahead, Amy.
I can't help it. This might be a primarily Gentile group. He says, I'm leaving you as Jews, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. And then in 1 Corinthians, he gives this long list of things that Jews most likely would not participate
Yeah.
in. And he says, except for some of you. So I have a feeling he's also this church is having to deal Whereas Gentiles are having to change many things that they're doing in a lot of cases. So I don't think this would be that unusual if you're dealing with a church that is coming out of that like that.
Yeah. It seems like you had more conversions out of the synagogues in previous cities where Paul would go. It seems like you have those notes that are given to us, and it just seems like Amy brought out, he visits that synagogue, and although he converts, it seems the leader of that synagogue, he beats his clothes outright and says, "I'm going to the Gentiles now," and it's a good point. Other thoughts? How Paul spent a year and a half here, and all these problems pop up. What lessons might that offer? Does that give us any lessons? One lesson for me, and maybe this is a point that I make for job security as a preacher, but you can have a preacher as great as Paul come in and then leave, and there's still problems. And I think we get in our minds, if we get the right guy, that all the problems are going to go away. Or certain churches can get that in their minds. And you find even with Paul, he spent a year and a half there, and he leaves, and all these problems came up. And that just shows you're working with people, and you're dealing with different issues in different areas. And even a guy like Paul is only in control so much. And I just kind of think that's interesting as well. Other thoughts? Okay, so that's kind of the problems that you see rising to the surface, but I just want to maybe just ask this and we can finish here. And I think this gives us kind of the character traits that we're seeing as well. While you see all those problems coming up, can we narrow it down to maybe 2 or 3 root problems? What was at the root of all these things they're dividing over? Dividing over gifts, dividing over teachers, suing each other. What was at the root of wanting to eat this meat sacrificed to idols and disregarding how it affects my brother? What was at the root of their attraction to these super apostles that Paul brings up in 2 Corinthians? What's at the root of these things? Go ahead, David, and then Michael.
The first 4 chapters of the first letter, he several times makes reference to their carnal attitudes. They just have a very worldly approach to everything. Now, even though they've embraced Christianity, they still are infected with this carnal attitude, and it just affects everything.
Yeah, totally. I think you definitely see that. Even in their evaluation of speakers, right, and teachers, it was carnal. It wasn't based off of what they're saying or the truth of it. It was based off of, I think, how they were saying it. Go ahead, Michael. I think you had your hand up, right? Everything's a competition. Yep. So competition trumped love, right? Other thoughts, Larry, and then Dan. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's pride, right? Dan?
Selfishness.
Yeah. Yeah. David?
Infatuation with leaders, which you see it in the first letter, they want that on all policies and so forth. But that might also explain in the second letter why Paul has to give instruction to the super apostles, these false teachers, that they have good tongues and they can, they're smooth talkers. These Corinthians just,
Yeah.
they start running down Paul. They're on board with it.
Yep. So for me, I kind of looked at 3 things. I think arrogance. Go back and read 1 and 2 Corinthians and notice how often Paul uses the words boast or boastful or puffed up or arrogant. I mean, I think he talks about that kind of attitude more than he does in any other of his epistles that he writes. And I won't go through all those different texts, but just even the last couple chapters of 2 Corinthians, he is forced to boast, and he hates that he has to do that. But I think he's also kind of speaking in that way to contrast himself from how all these other guys are boasting and how it's all that they can do, and they love to boast. And when he does boast, when Paul does boast, what does he boast in? What does he boast in? He boasts in his weaknesses. He boasts in the fact that he runs away during the night to escape death and those types of things. And so there's just this profound arrogance that seemed to exist there in Corinth. And then I think also just this self-centered kind of attitude. I think that's what was brought up. And again, in 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 9, where he's about to talk about meat being offered to idols, he says, take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak, right? So they just care about these rights of theirs, right? Just let me do what I want to do. And ultimately, that's what's motivating suing each other and stepping on each other for these gifts to exalt yourself. It's this self-centeredness and how can I advance myself as opposed to how can I advance the gospel. That was the least of their concerns. And again, Paul kind of contrasts himself from that attitude. At the end of 2 Corinthians, he says, look, do you think that we've been defending ourselves this whole time? He's like, no, if we are defending ourselves, it's just so that you can be saved. It's because we have the gospel. But that's kind of the attitude they were caught up in. I think this last one's really important. They had this attraction, and this is kind of what David was speaking to, this attraction to flash over substance. They had this attraction to how things appeared over how things actually are. And I read that they treated their speakers like pro athletes today, right? That when a really valued speaker came in, they just got all the applause. And it wasn't so much the substance of what they said, but it was their oratory skills, their speaking abilities. It was an art form. It's the same reason why we watch late night shows or something like that. It's not the truth of what they're saying. It's not the substance of what they're saying. It's because they're funny or they're entertaining. And, Paul didn't fit that mold. And it's just something he brings up constantly as you go through these passages. Again, I'll just read one of them, like 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 17. He says, for Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. Or chapter 2 and verse 1, when I came to you, brothers, I did not come proclaiming to you testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. Verse 4, and my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. Verse 13, let's see here. And we impart this not in words taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. You can go through the two epistles and you'll find the similar sentiment repeated over and over and over and over again. And so I think that when you look at these things, I think that kind of gives you a good idea, kind of the character traits that you see in Corinth. There's a lot of arrogance, a lot of self-centeredness, and a lot of attraction to this flash over substance. And there's a lot of churches and Christians that, we got to be careful that's not our attitude, that we're not attracted to the flash and how things are said or, plausible sounding arguments or how a person dresses or the vibes that we get from them, but that we are attracted to the truth. And that was, I think, really a big issue in Corinth, that they didn't prioritize the truth. They prioritized these kind of flashy displays of power and authority over what Paul was presenting. So those are all negative, and I know we're about out of time, and we'll just end with this one last question. And any positive character traits that you notice in Corinth? I struggled with that one. Yeah. Yes. So it seems like they're at least a repenting church, right? They just had a lot of issues on the front end of things. Anything else? Go ahead, Steve. Mm-hmm.
Paul's talking about horrible things inside the Torah or something.
Yeah.
I mean, they did turn to Christ. They were still opening it up sometimes. In general, they turned from the world toward Christ.
Yeah. In Corinth, the last time they're mentioned, Paul talks about how he left Erastus in Corinth in his letter that he writes to Timothy, the second letter. That's the last letter Paul writes chronologically that we have. And so that tells you they got through these things, because 1st and 2nd Corinthians are some of the earliest letters that we have from Paul. And so, 15 years later or so, they're still around. And so I think at the very least they were a repenting church, and that is a very good quality to have, is to be a church that's able to look at itself in the mirror and make the corrections that need to be made. Thanks for your comments. I know I went way over, but thanks for your patience. Enjoyed it.